I've had this new cow for like a week now, and she's like was really feral. Like she'd like almost try to break her own neck than be halter trained or come inside. And the whole time she's kicking as I'm trying to milk. You know, like a real wild cow. And and so I've just been working with her. I've just been keeping a consistent thing going with her, and I've been like the difference between like really controlling her with this halter and just pulling, even if she's like this, I'm just like, you know, it's like a fight. And then also the carrot of like, after you get milked, I will give you your favorite feed, which is alfalfa. She loves alfalfa. And the carrot works way more. Like now she's already off the halter eating and I'm milking her with, she does kick sometimes, but I'm doing it with like one hand holding the pail so I can just move it. When she's in a fear state, when I'm using the stick, her udders don't drop like they normally do. Like she doesn't give as much milk. Like you can get them going, but when they're not in a fear state, their udders are like engorged. You know, they can't wait to give you the milk. Like if they're looking, you know, if they're relaxed, if they're in a fear state where you're like just but it requires both at some point. Like I couldn't tempt her with food because she was wild. She was kicking and just going crazy. So I had to dominate her physically, but overall it doesn't work very well because they're not going to want to give you milk. So let's say you have a population. It's so applicable to the population. So let's say you have a population and you enslave them. And if you use whips and chains and all this theoretical bullshit that I don't even believe ever has really happened in the level that they say, you're not going to get great labor out of them. They've done studies, actual historical documents before like all this like pay a scientist to lie for you bullshit. Slave owners would talk about that once you like chattel slave a man, their production goes down like 40% and their life expectancy like splits in half. That's really bad farming humans. So let's say you're farming labor out of human beings. You want them to believe they're free and you want them to feel like you milking them is like their idea. And that's like the better society. And that's why they're always going to do that. It's always going to be consent driven. And the metaverse and all this shit, it's always going to be people. That's why they're getting a little desperate right now with the forcing of all this. Or they still can't force it. It's not possible. They are like, there's a desperation going on with these systems. Talk to your animals like beings. Oh, yeah. I talked to her. We're having a great relationship, me and this cow. Because there's two things happening right now. Quote unquote, they are getting more power from supply chain consolidation. This is why prices are going up. It's not inflation. It really isn't inflation. When you have like media and the Fed and all these people all telling you it's inflation, it's not. It's John D. Rockefeller said, was it John D. Rockefeller? Allegedly, that the only sin is competition. So competition is what keeps prices low because they have to compete with each other. Means of production are consolidating so much right now. Supply chains are consolidating so much that if there's only one supplier of an item or two suppliers of an item, they can keep the prices, like they can just start raising prices because they're like, where else are you going to go? It's a lot like that with drugs. You can see it on a micro versus the macro. Like, let's say you're in Los Angeles. I don't know what would be some good examples. Let's say there's a ton of drug dealers. You're going to get the best coke or weed or whatever because they're competing with each other. So if you give them shit, they're not going to go to you again. But if you go to like backwoods Montana and you're trying to find cocaine, it's going to be 3 times as expensive and it's going to be cut with all this baking soda. And they're like, well, this is shit. They're like, oh yeah, go to the other coke dealer then. And they're like, but there isn't one. It's like, but if you're in an area where there's a lot of drug dealers, drugs are much cheaper and much stronger. It's like that with everything. And the only reason I use that as an example is because that's obvious to see because it's like ground level. When you're dealing with, you know, copper tin manufacturing of like pipe fitting joints, if you have multiple companies, they compete against each other to lower the prices. When you're consolidating supply chains, you can just raise prices. You're like, well, where are you going to get it? Make your own car then. You can't go to the other dealership. They're like, oh no, we're also that. We own them. So now we're just going to raise all the prices. It's like that with sexual selection. It's like if you're the only attractive woman on a military base, you can get all the alpha males you want, and that's it. If you're like, if you're like a 5 on a military base, the top men will fight for you. If you're now in Manhattan, you're barely a one-night stand to like a busboy, and that's supply and demand. And so right now the competition is the consolidation of power and wealth is happening extremely fast. This should not scare you because you have to start developing your own supply chains and your own local things. Because what really matters, okay, you have food, no problem. You can get that done locally. What else really matters? Heat, electricity. The good news is you have governmental protections of that. That's why people that are opposed to their government are crazy. Municipalities, if there was one private company that owned all the gas and power, your electricity could be $10,000 a month. What are you going to do about it? See, now the flip side is if it was only private, what you could do about it is start using like Tesla tech and no longer need them, or solar power. Like there's this really good solar company that's out of Utah that I'm looking at that looks really promising, because that's the good thing about private is competition. It would take time, it would take resources, it would take organization. That's why they like to do the double whammy of lower everyone's morale, lower everyone's morality, get everyone addicted, despair, all that. Get them so overworked that they can't organize, make them fear each other, make them divide, and then have a monopoly. But the monopoly requires the government. That's like a lot of the biggest scams have been when the government's enforcement teams up with a private monopoly like YouTube or something. But even YouTube can't pull it off. Look, all it takes is a guy with Spark who won't, and look at what we've made. And then all you guys that want quality over bullshit. And so now we're at unauthorized, we're at all this awesome places. Imagine that in every sector, because the private doesn't have enforcement. There's no army of Panasonic doesn't have a SEAL Team 6. So and they're way far away from that. If that's on the agenda, or if that's down the line, they're not even close. Build, and build your community.